My grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Sachs, was the Jewish Forrest Gump. He participated in all the big moments of Jewish history, always playing a really small role. One of my favorite jobs as a child was walking him home on Friday nights. In the cold Jerusalem air, he would tell me stories of his life spent between America and Israel. It all began with his first road trip. The year was 1947, and my grandfather had returned from serving as a U.S. Army chaplain in Okinawa on the Japanese front of World War II. He was reunited at the San Francisco harbor with my grandmother, Frances, and together they got into their Ford Deluxe super sedan and renamed it Mizrahi, Hebrew for eastbound. They were to take the classic American road trip, Route 55. It was that trip, more than anything else, that reminded them that they loved America and had served it proudly during the war. But their trip did not end on the coast of the Atlantic. They continued eastbound to Palestine to seek their future in the land of Israel. My grandparents' journey between East and West, America and Israel, captures the blessings that the Jewish people have experienced in the second half of the 20th century. For 2,000 years, Jews have had two dreams: to be united and sovereign in their own ancestral homeland, and to flourish as free and equal citizens in the countries in which they reside. In our time, both of these dreams have come true. And they are both Zions. They are both promised lands. Exile and diaspora are over, for in both of these countries, Jews are at home like never before. Yet the thing is, neither community really sees the other's promised land. American and Israeli Jews behave like distant cousins at a family reunion who hug and kiss at the outset and then spend the rest of the evening looking straight past each other. They tiptoe around their differences, and yet at the same time they obsess about the existential threats that the other community faces. Israelis love to talk about the disappearing American Jew who is falling prey to intermarriage and assimilation. They deny that there can be a promised land outside Israel. American Jews, on the other hand, talk about the grave threats that vulnerable Israel faces, or they wring their hands at the way Israelis engage with their own power. More and more cousins on both sides are becoming disinterested in encountering those strange relatives from across the ocean. They see no point in engaging with people so different from who they are, simply because they are part of the same family. So we have arrived in the promised land, but turns out there's not one of them, but two. Can we tell a tale of two Zions? As someone who feels at home in both communities, I struggle with this question a lot. And yet I see no point in creating a canopy of superficial Jewish unity over the Jewish people. The opposite. I believe we need to grasp the very crux of the tension between these two communities. Because the truth is, America and Israel represent two very different projects with a different set of moral intuition that undermine, criticize, and challenge each other. And yet Jews have always made the most out of a good argument, and that is our challenge today. On those special Jerusalem nights walking my grandfather home, we'd sometimes take a detour through the Jerusalem neighborhood of Mikol Chaim. Outside the neighborhood is a small sign which describes how the Haganah conquered the neighborhood in 1948, protecting this small, isolated Jewish community. Standing next to the sign, my grandfather would tell me how he single-handedly protected Mikol Chaim in 1948. A few years later, my bus to school would drive by the neighborhood, and I would proudly tell my friends, "You see that neighborhood over there? That's Mikol Chaim, which my grandfather and I single-handedly protected in 1948. Now, I knew that I didn't protect anything in 1948. In fact, I knew that my grandfather didn't single-handedly do very much in the War of Independence. He was the Haganah's welfare officer, kept at the back of the unit to take care of the soldiers' psychological well-being. But none of that mattered. I had heard the story of Mikol Chaim so many times it had become a part of my DNA, a part of who I am. And today I shape my life based on that story. My grandfather's Haganah unit epitomizes for me what the Israeli Jewish Project is all about. Taking Judaism out of the synagogue and onto the streets. The Israeli Jewish Project turned Judaism into a secular civic project where Jews were returning to history, to taking collective responsibility for their people on their own ancestral land. They wanted to live a full-bodied Jewish life, speaking a full-throated Hebrew language and culture. Their creed was a question that Hillel had asked 2,000 years ago in the Mishnah. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Im ein anili, mili. For years, this story animated my life more than any other. Mizrahi, to the east, Israel is where the Jewish story unfolds, and everything else is no more than a backdrop. Yet, my grandparents' story didn't end there. In 1949, they received a telegram from the American Midwest. Daddy had a heart attack. Come home. And they did. This part of the story always confused me. The car named Mizrahi drove one direction only, east, and my grandparents' retreat westward seemed to me a moment of weakness. All those years in America, had they forgotten Hillel's question? Fast forward to 2009, my grandfather's Shiva. After 30 years as a rabbi in the Midwest, he had returned to Jerusalem, where I was born. By the time he passed away, I had just left Jerusalem for the first real time and was studying in New York, living on the same block that my grandfather had as a student 60 years before. At the Shiva, going through some of his files, we found some rolls from an old dictaphone and a small political button. They told the story that he had never told me before about a trip he took in 1963. It was the height of the civil rights protests in the South, and against the advice of his synagogue board, my grandfather decided to join a rabbinic delegation to Birmingham, Alabama. Standing outside the 16th Street Baptist Church, he got into a conversation with a group of African-American teenagers. One of them was wearing a button that said, "I believe in human dignity." He asked where he could get such a button himself. "Mister," the African-American teenager said to the tall white man in front of him, "do you believe in human dignity?" "Maybe," my grandfather teased with his eternal half-smile. "Then you are not entitled to this button, sir, not to the button that says, 'I believe in human dignity.'" Back in his synagogue in Minneapolis, wearing the button, my grandfather challenged his congregation. Do we believe in human dignity? Sitting in Jerusalem, holding the button in my hand, I began to realize that Jewish life in America was also a project. That for the first time in 2,000 years, Jews were truly invited to dedicate themselves to Hillel's second question. If I am only for myself, what am I? Ukshani la'atzmi, mani. Like Israel, America invited Jews to take part in a secular civic project. But its focus was not just Jews, but all Americans. Going beyond the us-them dichotomy which had defined so much of Jewish existence, Jews who had fled the ghettos could live among Jews and non-Jews alike, creating a promised land for both of them. Jews embraced the creed of "I believe in human dignity," not only because it made room for them, but because it connected with one of the most basic teachings of Jewish tradition, that every human being is created in the image of God. That is what my grandfather was doing in Birmingham in 1963 and as a rabbi in the Midwest all those years, taking ownership of his Jewishness in service of a better America. He was framing his activism through Judaism to shape this new promised land. My grandfather was taking Mizrahi home. Mikol Chaim and Birmingham are two stories that inform me as I shape my life. But they also play out the tension between the Israeli and American Jewish projects, these two promised lands, these two Zions. The first Zion is unabashedly particularistic. It takes place in the ancestral homeland with Jews as its main constituents and speaks the internal Jewish language of Hebrew. It is about Jews returning to their land, taking collective responsibility for themselves. The second Zion takes place in a new land, America, which speaks a global language, English. It is unabashedly universalistic and invites Jewish creativity to play out on the world stage, where it is often much more uncomfortable to give a Jewish frame to things. Each in their own way, these two projects and the tension between them are playing out the questions that Hillel asked 2,000 years ago. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Now, I know that reality in America and Israel is much more complex than these basic questions. And yet, as we face the challenges of the 21st century, as we face our own, if not now, when, moments, we must look not only to our own story, but at the other promised land, which challenge, criticizes us, and inspires us to be better. To say it another way, Israel and America can be the yin-yang of the Jewish people. Yin-yang describes how contrary forces in nature are actually interconnected and interdependent. Light and darkness, fire and water, hot and cold, the Israeli Jewish project and the American one. Two projects so different from each other and yet contain elements of the other inside them that prod and pull, challenge and inspire, creating a whole greater than the sum of its parts. This yin-yang plays out in various ways. For American Jews, in their commitment to universal human dignity, are constantly increasingly asking, why be Jewish? The Israeli Jewish Project presents for them a powerful case that the commitment to universalism starts with embracing the particular. That Jewish identity thrives when immersed in Hebrew language, culture, and geography. And that we learn love and dignity, ethics, from our family first. For Israeli Jews, in their commitment to in-group loyalty, they're struggling to find room for the voice of the individual. They are challenged by an American Jewish project that says that the dignity of the individual is a supreme Jewish value for Jews and non-Jews alike, and that a healthy, modern Jewish identity must rest in free individual choice. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the way in which the American and Israeli Jewish projects challenge each other and inspire each other to ask the questions of the 21st century. Before he died, I was lucky enough to have my grandfather hold my daughter, his first great-granddaughter, in his arms. Zohar, who was born in the Israel that he helped found, raised in the America that he loved. I wonder, what will be her dreams? What will be the Jewish projects that she will dedicate her life to? We're lucky to live in a time in which both Jewish dreams have come true. Both in Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim, and in New Zion, which is America, Jews are living successful stories of arrival. And yet, as I think of my grandfather's escapades in Birmingham and Mekor Chaim, I feel a twinge of jealousy. His struggles seem so stark, his ethical choices clear. Our own challenges seem so much more mundane, the ethical choices we face so muddled. And yet, my grandfather, that Jewish Forrest Gump indeed, never knew which moments of his life would be no more than passing anecdotes and which would shape world history. He stuck true to his values and his story and always made it a priority to learn from those different from him. I hope I live up to that creed myself. I hope we all do. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching Eli Talks. Click through or subscribe to the Eli Talks channel for more inspired Jewish ideas.